of the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity is the iris, and now you have to process that.
Yeah.
That's not very helpful. It confuses a lot of people. So, real simple, we're going to separate it at the lens. Okay? Everything behind the lens is the posterior cavity. Everything in front of the lens is the anterior cavity. So that right there, what is the posterior border of the posterior cavity?
Right now?
What is the posterior border of the posterior cavity? I'm saying it this way because your questions will be phrased like this.
The retina.
The retina. That's the posterior border. So you have the retina all the way around there. What is the anterior border of the posterior cavity?
The lens.
The lens. So what's the posterior border of the anterior cavity?
The lens.
The lens. What's the anterior border of the anterior cavity?
Cornea.
The cornea. Everyone clear on that? Simple enough? Okay, now the anterior cavity is divided into two chambers. The posterior cavity is not divided into chambers at all. And it is divided at the iris. So everything in front of the iris is the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity. Everything behind the iris is the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity.
Posterior chamber of the anterior cavity.
And the anterior chamber of the posterior cavity. That's it.
Wait, anterior chamber of the posterior?
Anterior chamber of the anterior cavity.
And then
And the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity. Okay, everyone follow on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. It really is that simple. I don't know why they teach it another method, but it confuses people. But it really is that simple. So now, if you see a question and it says, for example, what is the anterior border of the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity?
It is the iris.
Yes, it's the
Wait,
iris.
say that again?
It'll be easier when you see it on writing.
Okay.
The anterior border of the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity.
Oh, so,
Do you see why that's the iris?
yeah.
So what's the posterior border of the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity?
Say that again?
Posterior border of the
The posterior border of the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity.
Iris
Border,
again.
oh,
It's the
yeah.
iris, right?
Yeah.
Trying to trick us.
This is how the questions will be phrased.
Yeah.
So what is the anterior border of the posterior cavity? The lens. What is the anterior border of the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity?
cornea.
The cornea. Everyone get that?
Yeah.
It really is that simple. There's another way to think about it too if you're just going for straight memorization, which I don't recommend, but people do. The other way to think about it is you have three chambers. You have posterior cavity, you have posterior chamber of anterior cavity, and think of that as one name. So that right there is one name of the chamber. Posterior chamber of anterior cavity. I want you to think of that as one name. And then anterior chamber of anterior cavity. Also think of that as one name. That helps simplify things.
And what are the fluids that are in that? Is it vitreous humor in the posterior cavity?
Yes.
And aqueous humor.
And
in the-
aqueous humor in the anterior cavity. So both of these are filled with aqueous humor because the entire anterior cavity is aqueous humor.
Is there anything
And
in the
the-
chambers?
The chambers are still part of that cavity. The entire cavity, both chambers, are filled with aqueous humor. So when you're tracing a beam of light, how do you trace it?
The anterior chamber of the anterior cavity, the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity, the posterior cavity.
Now what about the structures as well? Let's add the structures. Everything it hits.
Cornea, iris, lens, retina.
Retina.
Yes. So if you're tracing it from start to finish, you would say the cornea into the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity filled with aqueous humor, through the pupil of the iris into the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity, still filled with aqueous humor, then into the lens, then into the posterior cavity filled with vitreous humor, then into the fovea centralis of the macula luta of the retina.
Is that going to be an essay question?
You should be able to trace a beam of light.
Okay, yeah. Because if I can see it on
you
paper,
learn the
for
anatomy,
sure.
and it may come up as extra credit questions. It did for our class,
We get to have extra credit on these?
sometimes. Not always.
Huh.
We had that as an extra credit question. We had to trace a beam of light. In addition to that, you should get used to studying by tracing, because next you're going to have to trace a drop of blood through the entire body.
Okay.
And then you're going to have to trace a breath of air, which is more complicated than it sounds. And you also have to be able to trace a drop of filtrate from the bloodstream through your kidneys and out, which is also more complicated than it sounds because you have to describe the structures of individual nephrons.
And that's all in the next 3 weeks? That's nice.
No, it's throughout the next semester you'll have all these tracings. And then you'll also have to, in anatomy, and you'll also have to trace a bolus of food all the way through your digestive tract. And all the structures it passes, including the valves.
This is not physiology?
This is not physiology, this is anatomy.
That's after
So-
this test, 3 more weeks. Wow, that's great.
So get used to tracing.
Nice. Okay.
Definitely get used to tracing. That's a very